Hey everybody, welcome back. I want to take some time tonight just to go over the amendments with you, and I don't want to take up too much of your time, but this is something that we're really not going to have a lot of time to go into great detail on all 27 amendments in class, and so I want to be able just to talk about some of these with you. We are going to spend a lot more time throughout the year taking these a bit, kind of bite-sized chunks along the way, and immediately I do want to spend some more time this week and next week talking about the First Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, the 10th Amendment, and the 14th Amendment. But the other ones a lot of times get neglected, and so I just want to make sure that we've at least been able to talk about it a little bit. So we started today talking about the first. I want to talk about the first some more during class tomorrow, but as long as you're remembering your freedom of spar, the rights that you're willing to fight for, you've got your speech, your press, petition, assembly, and religion. And if you remember all five of those, think of your five fingers in the fist. You've got your First Amendment. For the Second Amendment, you've got your right to bear arms. You've got two arms, right to bear arms, right to own guns, and to also form a militia. That's something else that gets left out of the Second Amendment, but if you look through the Second Amendment in your pocket constitutions, you'll see that it is a right for militias to form. And a lot of time there's debate about this. We'll probably get into this debate also in class about, well, at the time there weren't fully automatic weapons, so does that mean that citizens should be able to arm themselves against their government if their government was to turn on them, the way that it happened during the American Revolution? And so there's lots of different implications about what a well-armed society really looks like, and we'll get into that. The Third Amendment is no quartering of troops. That comes straight off of the American Revolution. If you've ever seen the movie The Patriot, towards the beginning at Benjamin Martin's house, you see both Patriot soldiers and you see redcoats hanging out at his house. And the redcoats were there because that was a decree by the King of England. Last year you should have learned in Georgia Studies about the Quartering Act. And this was an act that was passed that said that the colonists had to take in troops. And so this was a way that King George could not deplete his expense account. He could just kind of put it on the colonists and say, you guys have got to take care of the lodging of these soldiers. And so when we kicked off the chains of British rule, one of the first personal liberties that we wanted to establish was to make sure that that could never happen again. Now, if you want to let a soldier come into your house, you have that prerogative, but it's something that the central government or that our United States government and our state governments cannot force upon us. So that's the Third Amendment. The Fourth Amendment deals with unreasonable searches. They can't happen. You can't have a search of your property without a warrant. There are some different waivers, some loopholes, and we're going to talk about that a little bit. There is something that's called a Fourth Amendment waiver. So if someone has a history or if somebody is arrested, part of their pardon or part of their parole might possibly be that they have given up their Fourth Amendment rights for a certain amount of time, and they could be subject to a search without a warrant. Your rights at school are a little bit different. We're going to talk in class about New Jersey versus TLO. We're going to talk about search and seizure there. We're also going to talk about a court case called Mapp versus Ohio that established having the police having a search warrant to come into your house and search through things. We'll talk in class about the difference between probable cause and also reasonable suspicion, and how a school resource officer's jurisdiction at school is just a little bit different than a school principal, and exactly what can teachers do. Today we have issues with cell phones. Can teachers look through your cell phone messages? Do you have the right to take out your battery or turn off your phone to make sure they don't look at your text messages? And again, tons of implications that the Founding Fathers would never have thought of when it comes to search and seizure. The Fifth Amendment really sets up two things. It sets up due process. This is a term that you really need to nail down. Due process means that you have the right to a trial. And this is something that both Locke and Voltaire wrote endlessly about how citizens in a progressive society deserve the right to a fair trial. They shouldn't just be rotting away in a prison somewhere. So you've got due process, which means that you should be able to have a lawyer. This means that you should be able to have a judge listen to your case, and you should be able to present evidence that shows it proves your innocence, and it should be innocent until proven guilty. That comes along with this as well. The other element that comes along with the Fifth Amendment is no double jeopardy. So we can discuss some what ifs in class, but essentially this means that if you are tried for a crime, if you're accused of a crime, and the verdict is not guilty, then if more evidence was to come out later that showed that perhaps you did commit this crime, you cannot be tried for that same exact instance a second time. Now, there are some different degrees of murder or different types of charges where they could come back and they could slap something else on someone if there was more evidence proving that they were at the scene of the crime. But as far as that same exact crime at that same exact time, no double jeopardy, protected by the Fifth Amendment. So what this does is it keeps our court systems from being bogged down by unnecessary retrials. The Sixth Amendment, not only do you have the right to a trial, the Sixth Amendment gives you the right to a speedy trial. And so with all due process and all due haste, I should say, all due speed that's possible, you get that court case in a reasonable amount of time. And it might seem like our court cases, our court system is really slow, but that's just because of the volume of cases that we have. It's also because we need to have a reasonable amount of time to put together for our lawyers, our defense attorneys, and our prosecution attorneys to put together evidence to build that case. The Seventh Amendment is the right to a jury. And so for civil cases, this would be a case where it's kind of like a he said, she said. I'm sorry, it's not a he said, she said. She said. It's kind of hard to say. This would be in a case where there has been an accusation of a crime. Civil case would be more like a Judge Judy or what you might see on TV, where that is a he said, she said. Divorce court, small claims court, those types of things, you're not going to see a jury. But if it's where a crime has been committed or someone is accused of committing a crime, you do have the right to have a jury listen to the case, weigh the evidence, and then deliver a verdict that the court would honor. The Eighth Amendment to the Constitution, a lot of times, is known as no cruel or unusual punishment. So you're going to have to serve the time or the punishment based upon the crime that was committed. So if you're accused of stealing a loaf of bread and the verdict is guilty, the punishment's not going to be that your hands are chopped off or anything else along those lines. That would be considered cruel and unusual. So the big debate with this amendment is lethal injection. At one time, the death penalty through electric chair. Are these considered cruel and unusual, or is that within the bounds of the federal government or the state governments to punish crimes? And we'll talk more about that in the class as well. The Ninth and the Tenth Amendments, remember there was 10 initial through the Bill of Rights. The Ninth and the Tenth are sort of like the catch-alls. And so with the Ninth Amendment, we'll call this rights of the people. And the Founding Fathers wanted to make sure that they had a safety net for people's rights, that they couldn't just list absolutely every personal freedom that people have. You have the right to walk down the street, to get married, to eat food, to breathe. But if they continue to list all of these small freedoms that you have, this would be an endless list, and something would always be amended. And so this was supposed to be a catch-all, that if the federal government does not already outright say that something is illegal, that you don't have freedom to do this, then you do have freedom to do it. The rights of the people are very, very broad, and there's a lot of room for interpretation. But as long as it's not clearly outlawed, you have the right to do it. The 10th Amendment is similar to this in that we'll call it the rights of the states. This was the one that we talked about a little bit in class today when we were talking about legalization of marijuana in Colorado and also in Washington, where if there's something that's not outright expressed by the federal government as being illegal, or saying that this is under federal jurisdiction, then the states will get to make up their mind on this. And so the one that I mentioned in class was helmets, the helmet law. So in Georgia, if you're on a bicycle or a motorcycle, you have to wear a helmet. You go to Florida or South Carolina, you don't have to. And that's because of the jurisdiction that's turned over to the states because of federalism under the 10th Amendment. Now, if the federal government does have an issue with a state law because there's a higher federal law, then that falls under the supremacy clause that we discussed today in class under the 4th article of the Constitution. So those are your Bill of Rights. Now we're going to jump right into the next set, 11 through 27, and I'm going to try to rattle these off just so you get the basic nugget of what the amendment is all about. So with 11, we're going to call it sovereign immunity. And with the 11th Amendment, one of the big issues under the Articles of Confederation was that states could not sue other states. Well, there wasn't a court for this. So the 11th Amendment, or the Constitution, allows for states to sue other states. But the 11th Amendment provided states an out. So if a state wanted to be subject to a lawsuit, then they would give other states permission to sue them. And this sounds pretty insane. Today, every state has given up sovereign immunity except for Virginia. So today, if someone wanted to file a lawsuit against a state, they could do it. Virginia, you have to get permission from the state to do it. But last year, if you learned about Worcester versus the state of Georgia, this is the court case that was between Andrew Jackson and or the federal government trying to push out the Native Americans, the Cherokee in northeast Georgia around New Echota. So you had you had people within the state of Georgia suing the state of Georgia, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court. So that's the 11th Amendment. The 12th Amendment basically says that the president, whoever's running for president, the number one man, has to go ahead and announce his number two man. That's how I remember the 12th Amendment. And I might be showing that backwards for you. So the 12th Amendment says that whoever is running for president has to state who his vice president would be. This sounds pretty obvious to us today. But before the 12th Amendment, there was a crazy setup on how we would define who our vice president was. Before the 12th Amendment, whoever got the greatest amount of electoral votes became the president, and whoever the runner-up was became the vice president. So we had, for our second president, John Adams becoming president, and the runner-up, Thomas Jefferson, becoming vice president. And you may not realize this because these guys kind of seem stoic and they don't seem like they have real emotions, but those two guys hated each other. They absolutely hated each other. They came from two political parties, different political ideologies. John Adams wanted a strong centralized government. Thomas Jefferson said, no, we need states' rights. And so they realized, who becomes president if something happens to the president? Well, conveniently, the vice president, who hates the president's guts. And so they realized they needed to have a different setup. So if there was no 12th Amendment, today, Barack Obama would be our president, and his vice president would be not Joe Biden, but Mitt Romney. You can see the problems there. Two different political philosophies and ideologies. They're constantly going to butt heads, so they scrap that and they come up with the 12th Amendment. Okay, so the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments all come in. They're your civil liberties or freedom amendments. With the 13th Amendment, this is what followed along with the Emancipation Proclamation. This frees the slaves. It makes slavery illegal in the United States. Along with that, when the slaves were freed, people in Congress realized that the next step was to make sure that these freed slaves were treated equally, that they did have U.S. citizenship. So the 14th Amendment provides equal protection under law. That should sound familiar from when you did the pretest. That was one of the questions on the pretest, the importance of the 14th Amendment and equal protection under the law. A lot of you, I think every single one of you maybe bombed that one. So you're getting a little bit of information about that now. And as I said, we're going to talk more about the 14th Amendment in class. But this is what establishes citizenship. It also protects your life, liberty, and not the pursuit of happiness, but property. So there's your echo of Locke, again, in our government's foundation. The 15th Amendment, so the 13th freed the slaves. The 14th provides slaves with citizenship. But there were still Jim Crow laws and these rampant obstacles throughout the United States that kept former slaves from voting. And so the 15th Amendment established black male suffrage. Now notice I said male. Black women could still not vote. And in fact, women couldn't vote in general, or at all. There was no federal women's suffrage. So the 15th Amendment at this time does give black male suffrage. So at this point, men over the age of 21 in the United States could vote. So we've got our 14th, 15th, 16th Amendment is the amendment that created income tax. This established a tax just right off the top of everybody's paycheck. And the way that I remember that one, if you think about a 16 in your head, you think of the loop of the 6, I imagine it looking like a pair of scissors, and the scissors is just cutting away at your paycheck, cutting off about 30-ish% or so, maybe more depending on what state you're in and what century or decade you live in as well. The 17th Amendment, before the 17th Amendment, there was not direct election of senators. A lot of times the governor of the state would appoint two people to be the two senators for the state. And I guess that you would probably see that the problems here are pretty obvious. It was the good old boy system where the governor would take care of his friends, and it was just this cycle of corruption. And so people in the United States demanded that they would be able to directly elect senators of over 30 years or older of age, 9-year U.S. citizen. They would serve for 6 years in the Senate and then be up for re-election. The 18th Amendment. All right. So in the 18th Amendment, all throughout the United States, there was a couple of things going on. There was a women's temperance movement that encouraged zero tolerance or zero, basically abstinence from alcohol in general. There was also this wave of xenophobia. This might be a new word, but this wave of fear of foreigners. And a lot of foreign groups that were coming into the United States in the late 1800s, they did bring with them different types of alcohol. And so people saw two different problems being solved by prohibiting alcohol in the United States. Number one, through the women's temperance movement, you have this end to men earning wages, going to the bar or the pub on the way home, and spending all their family's money, and then coming home and either verbally or physically abusing their wives and children, in general, neglecting them. The other problem that could possibly be solved in the mind of the temperance movement folks was a lot of these immigrants that were coming in that just failed to yield and assimilate into the United States culture. If you get rid of their alcohol, maybe there's something about that alcohol that brings them together, and they're able to have this camaraderie with each other in their pubs or wherever it is that they're partying. And so people thought, we get rid of this, then we're good to go. So the 18th Amendment did prohibit alcohol in the United States, and everybody stopped drinking and everything was fine. No, that's not at all what happened. People continued to drink. People bootlegged alcohol. They set up businesses that were illegal. They ran moonshine in the South. In Chicago and New York and in Boston, you had the speakeasies popping up. You had back rooms available with people still serving alcohol. So this was a problem that did not end. It just ended for most of the people who were willing to obey the law. So that's the 18th Amendment. We're going to come back to that one in a little bit. With the 19th Amendment, this is women's suffrage. So if you remember Mary Poppins, even though that happened in the United Kingdom, if you remember the women's suffragette song at the beginning, that same idea was happening in the United States. And there's a great movie called Iron-Jawed Angels that depicts this movement, this women's suffrage movement. Woodrow Wilson was president. There were women who would protest out in front of the White House. They were beaten, they were arrested, they were put in mental asylums, and finally they were given the right to vote. So after the 19th Amendment, women and men of any race who were U.S. citizens over the age of 21 could vote in the United States. The 20th Amendment. The 20th Amendment we'll call lame duck. And what that means is that the date that the newly elected president came into office moved up from March the 3rd to January the 22nd. So it used to be you'd elect your president the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November, and then you would just wait and 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 wait until March the 3rd. The new guy would come in. You've got a quarter of the year already passed by that point. And this was really obvious when James Buchanan was president right before Abraham Lincoln. So Buchanan knew he was leaving office. He was the lame duck president. He was outgoing. He saw what was happening in the South. He basically said, I don't want to do anything. I'm just going to sit around for the next few months. So when Abraham Lincoln came into office in early March of the next year, 6 southern states had already left the United States and formed their own country. So this took a long time for this amendment to come into place, but that was sort of a lot of the drive was to keep that type of a situation from happening again. So this moves the date up into January. So our president takes office a lot earlier. With modern technology and instant ballot projections, some people have said maybe a new amendment would be presented to Congress where we could move it up even sooner, and the new president could take office maybe on January 1 or potentially even earlier than that. With the 21st Amendment, going back to Prohibition with the 18th, because people were still rum running, because people were still bootlegging, because you had all of these houses of all these pubs and speakeasies popping up all over the United States, the government just could not maintain the G-men, who were these officers that worked for the IRS, trying to find all of these guys that were running whiskey and beer and other types of alcohol. So they decided, Woodrow Wilson was president. They were coming out of the Great Depression, and Woodrow basically said, look, we're spending a ton of money trying to find these guys. People are still getting the alcohol anyway. Why don't we just repeal this act or this amendment? Let's do away with this amendment. Let's act like it never happened and put a tax on the alcohol. People are going to buy the alcohol anyway, so if we put a tax on it, we'll at least make a little bit of money. So they did away with the 18th Amendment, excuse me. They repealed the 18th Amendment. That is the 21st. And the way that I can remember that, and the way that you can remember that, at 18 years old, you can do a lot of things. You can buy cigarettes. You don't want to, but you could buy cigarettes. You can vote. You can serve, or you do have to apply for selective service, or register for selective service. But you can't drink in the United States at 18. At 21, you are at legal age. So 18th Amendment, no alcohol. 21st Amendment repeals the 18th. Very, very easy way to remember that. 22nd Amendment, Franklin Delano Roosevelt again. He's elected a fourth term as president. Now he dies soon after he's elected for his fourth term, but he was in office going on between 12 and 13 years. So if he would have stayed in there for a full final term, he would have been president for 16 years. That's a long time to be president. He was a Democrat. Republicans said we can't let this happen again. They had passed the 22nd Amendment, which limits the president to 2 terms. As soon as FDR is out, Harry Truman comes in. He finishes off for Roosevelt. Eisenhower comes in, and Eisenhower does a decent job, and the Republicans say, I wish we would have waited a little bit about that one, because he served his 2 terms as president, and then he had to step down after that. But the 2 terms comes from a model that was set by George Washington, by Thomas Jefferson, and by Abraham Lincoln. That's about what would be considered reasonable for a person to serve as president. The 23rd Amendment, we're getting near the end. I can see the light. 23rd Amendment, it's kind of a crazy amendment when you think about it, but it does give suffrage to the people of Washington, D.C. What was happening before the 23rd Amendment, Washington is this box, and it's not in Virginia, and it's not in Maryland, but it's made up of what used to be Virginia and what used to be Maryland. It's a district of Columbia, that's split in half by the Potomac River. So what was happening is, and what does happen is, when you vote for president, you cast your votes to an electoral college that represents your state. So people who lived in Washington, D.C., they don't have a state. You're in a district that's outside of the state. So people who lived in the nation's capital didn't have suffrage, didn't have the right to vote for president, which seems crazy. So in the nation's capital, people in D.C. couldn't vote. So the 23rd Amendment gives people in Washington, D.C. electoral representation. 23 D.C. D.C. 23. The 24th Amendment ended poll tax. Before the 24th Amendment, some places, if you wanted to vote, you had to pay a little bit of money. The poor people in the United States, which would be the majority of the people at this time, if you have to pick between voting and feeding your family, what are you going to pick? You're going to pick to feed your family. So what was set up before this point was that you had wealthy people voting for wealthy people who made wealthy decisions to help out wealthy people. And this cycle was also perpetuated until the 24th Amendment, which ended poll tax, and now everyone has suffrage, or the right to vote. You can't have any type of literacy test. You can't have any type of poll tax. All that you are required to vote would be 18 years old, a U.S. citizen, and registered. We'll talk about exactly what that means later. 25th Amendment, this is what establishes the presidential succession line, and this is a fun one to talk about too, where you have all the what ifs of what if the Secretary of State and the President pro temp and the Speaker of the House and the Vice President and the President, who would become president if something happened to all these people? And then if it went through the whole list of the 18 secretaries, what would happen then, and then what would happen, and what? You get to a point where it's so ridiculous that, first of all, it wouldn't matter who the president was, because we'd be in such a state of chaos. But there is a line of succession that goes down pretty far. I'll show you in class the line of succession down to a point that you really need to care about. We've never gone past the vice president. But the 25th Amendment does set up that line of succession. And as long as all of the secretaries of all the different federal departments are born in the United States or a U.S. military base, 35 years old, and lived in the United States for the last 14 years, then they are eligible to become president if it were to come down to them in the line of succession. You won't read The Last Babylon this year, but if you ever come across that book, it kind of gives a scenario of a doomsday situation where a lot of the people that immediately follow the president were killed in this event, and so it falls into the lap of someone who's further down the list on the line of succession. 2 more. The 26th Amendment. 26th Amendment followed the Vietnam War, and a lot of soldiers and advocates for soldiers realized that at 18 years old you could go and you could fight to defend your country, but you didn't have suffrage at 18 years old to vote for the person who was deciding to send you to go and die for your country. At that time, suffrage or the right to vote was still set at 21 years old. And so the 18th Amendment, the 26th Amendment, 26th Amendment lowers that suffrage or that age of voting from 21 to 18. So today, we can vote at 18 years old if we've registered and we're a United States citizen. The last amendment to the United States Constitution as of today is the 27th Amendment. It was written in 1992, and what this does is it sets a congressional pay raise limit. So, in case you didn't know, Congress gets to vote for their own pay raises. Pretty nice, right? The catch is in the 27th Amendment, and the catch is that if I vote for a pay raise for myself, and I'm a member of Congress, I don't get to see that pay raise until after the next election. So potentially, I vote for myself to get a pay raise, and my constituency, or the people that are voting for me, find out about this pay raise, and they decide that they don't want to vote for me anymore. And so I lose the election. The person who follows me is then eligible for the pay raise, not me. So this is a way to kind of keep Congress in check from constantly just padding their wallets as big as they could possibly dream. Okay, so I've crammed all 27 of these amendments into your head. I know that this is just a brief little survey. As I said at the beginning, we're going to go over the ones that we really need to spend a lot of time on. But I do want to give you something that you can refer back to, just in case the Pocket Constitution is intimidating and you're thinking you're just not going to be able to get it. Also, take advantage of the packet that I had in class that I ran off that gives a rundown of the 27 amendments. I want you to be studying over these amendments. Next week we're going to have an amendment quiz. And let me know if you guys have any questions or if there's something that I said that was completely backwards and I just didn't realize it because of me talking so fast or because of the time of the evening. All right, guys. Have a great night, and I'll see you tomorrow.